I'm Richard Southern. Happy Friday. What's lurking up there in the sky?
In 1998, during the first space shuttle mission to the International Space Station,
the first thing we try to do is to take pictures of what we see so that we have photographic evidence.
NASA accidentally captured an image of a mysterious black object orbiting Earth.
Other footage from the ISS has reinforced the idea that strange things are happening up in orbit.
At the time, they had no idea what it was, and neither did anyone else. For a long while, the object remained unexplained, and there are still discussions about whether it's still in space.
Mysterious close encounter. This object you see here was caught on camera flying past the SpaceX rocket just minutes after liftoff last week,
moving silently along Earth's orbit. The only thing we know about the object is its name, the Black Knight Satellite. The origin of that name is also a mystery, adding to the intrigue of this unusual object. Over the years, various theories and stories have tried to explain it, but the most prominent ones seem to trace back to Nikola Tesla. In 1899, Tesla was conducting radio experiments in his lab in Colorado Springs. During one of these tests, he noticed something odd. He was picking up radio signals from space. This was in 1899, long before any satellites existed, so Tesla was left with one possibility, even though it sounded unbelievable. He was convinced that he had made contact with aliens. In a 1901 article for Collier's Weekly, Tesla wrote about his experiences. The changes I noted were taking place periodically, and with such a clear suggestion of number and order that they were not traceable to any cause known to me. The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greeting of one planet to another. Tesla believed he had made the first contact between Earth and beings from another planet. Some speculate that this was when the Black Knight sent its first signal, in a way similar to the plot of the three-body problem. This theory gained traction when, in 1927, a civil engineer and ham radio user named Jorgen Haus began noticing strange echoes in his radio signals. While transmitting from his home in Oslo, Haus's signals would bounce back to him seconds later, like an echo from space. Haus thought this could be proof of something extraterrestrial, further supporting Tesla's idea. In 2013, nearly 50 years after Haus's death, an article in Analog Science Fiction and Fact revisited the mystery of the radio signals. That's when Duncan Lunin came into the picture. Lunin suggested that the delayed echoes could have come from an object orbiting the Moon, potentially one that originated 13,000 years ago. The 13,000-year figure was based on the position of the North Pole star, Polaris. Lunin explained, "I tried plotting the delay times against the order in which the echoes were received, and at only the second attempt, I found what looked like a star map." The signals Haus was receiving were actually something called long-delay echoes. These are radio signals that come back to the sender a few seconds after the original transmission. It's kind of like when you watch a live football match on TV and on the internet, but the TV broadcast is slightly faster. This delay happens because of the time it takes for the signal to travel. In some cases, the delay is so small you wouldn't notice, but sometimes it's longer. Any delay longer than 2.7 seconds is considered an LDE, and it can be a pretty complex topic. What's important is that back then, people didn't fully understand this, which made it confusing for many. In 1954, newspapers like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner reported that the U.S. Air Force had found 2 satellites orbiting the Earth. The strange part? At that time, no country had the technology to launch satellites. The Black Knight satellite was mentioned by several sources, and even though the U.S. denied it, there were credible reports from other countries confirming its existence. This object was first referenced by Nikola Tesla in 1899, then by Haus and a group of scientists in 1927. again by the U.S. Air Force in 1954, and later in 1998 by NASA. So, what was this mysterious black object that seemed to be orbiting Earth for decades? By 1960, both the U.S. and the USSR were launching spacecraft into orbit, competing in the space race. But on February 11th of that year, news spread that something else was orbiting Earth. It had been picked up by a radar made by the U.S. Navy to detect enemy spy satellites. Instead of finding spy planes, the radar detected a dark, tumbling object that didn't belong to either the Americans or Soviets. The next day, more details came out. It was orbiting about 79 degrees from the equator, not 90 degrees as would be expected for a true polar orbit. Its orbit was also very unusual, with its highest point, apogee, v 1,728 kilometers from Earth, and its lowest point perigee, only 216 kilometers. This object completed one orbit every 104.5 minutes. At the same time, the U.S. Navy was tracking an old casing from a Discoverer rocket launch. This casing, just under 6 meters long, was part of a test launch from November 1959. The mission aimed to eject a capsule, but the capsule got lost in orbit, similar to the Black Knight, and was later declared missing. The Navy tracked a casing that orbited every 103 minutes, with a very different orbit. Its apogee was 950 kilometers, and its perigee was 187 kilometers. While this casing passed near the Black Knight, it wasn't the same object. There were two objects. One was a human-made satellite, and the other remained a mystery. In September 1960, after radar first detected the satellite, a camera at Grumman Aircraft Corporation's Long Island factory captured a picture of it. By that time, people on the ground had already spotted it for about 2 weeks. They described it as a red glowing object moving from east to west. Most satellites at the time moved from west to east, but this one went the other way. Plus, it moved 3 times faster than usual. A committee was quickly set up to investigate, but the results were never made public. For a while, everything went quiet. Then, in 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper claimed he saw a greenish UFO during his 15th flight on Mercury 9. But here's the interesting part. Not only did Cooper see it, but about 100 people at NASA's tracking station in Perth, Australia, also spotted it on their radar. The government later claimed Cooper's equipment malfunctioned and that he was seeing things due to too much carbon dioxide. This explanation seemed odd, considering Cooper was a key astronaut for NASA. He was the youngest person to fly, the pilot of the last Mercury spaceflight, the first American to spend an entire day in space, and the first to sleep in space. If he was seeing things, why would NASA let him keep flying? Despite the official explanation, it became harder to deny the existence of the Black Knight satellite. Fast forward to 1927, when Scottish researchers, led by Duncan Lunan, revisited what a Norwegian scientist named House had heard. Lunan studied the data and discovered it was a star map pointing to Epsilon Bootis, a double star in the Bootes constellation. It appeared the Black Knight was sending a message from the people of Epsilon Bootis, and according to Lunan, they had been sending this signal for around 12,600 years. Epsilon Bootis is a double star system located in the northern constellation of Bootes. It's visible to the naked eye, but seeing both stars clearly requires a telescope with an aperture of at least 3 inches. When Lunan shared his findings, he was ridiculed and dismissed as crazy. However, in 1998, the Space Shuttle Endeavour's mission to the International Space Station brought new attention. Astronauts aboard Endeavour took photos of a strange object that looked strikingly similar to the Black Knight. These photos were shared publicly on NASA's website, reigniting interest in the object. While it's unlikely the same object could have lasted from 1899 to 1998, the more people researched, the more it seemed like it could be the same one. Here's the strange part. After the photos were posted, they mysteriously disappeared from NASA's website, only to reappear later under different URLs and with new descriptions labeling the object as space junk. Given that Earth is surrounded by space junk, calling it that seemed like an easy way to dismiss the object. There are more than 100,000 pieces of space debris just floating around Earth, waiting to fall back down. These pieces are broken parts of old equipment and rock fragments that have ended up in orbit around us. But here's a question. If they were space junk in the first place, why were the original pictures removed and then re-uploaded? That seems pretty suspicious to me. It turns out this is something NASA does quite a bit. Several people have come forward, claiming that NASA often alters its photos to remove what I call interesting photobombs, or UFO sightings, before releasing them to the public. Back in the day, all the editing was done manually, but today, software like Photoshop handles a lot of that work. And as I mentioned, the fact that these photos were taken down and re-uploaded with the label space junk makes it hard to trust the story. Here's something not everyone knows about NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which created NASA, allows the agency to keep certain information secret for national security reasons. I can see why the Air Force might do that, or even Instagram for business reasons, but what could NASA possibly need to keep secret about space for security purposes? I'm not sure, but maybe you have an idea. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. The strange part is that people who lived through the 50s and 60s can tell you that no one knew what the mysterious satellite or object was back then. It was a fact. No one had answers. But suddenly, if you search for the Black Knight now, the story is tied to a 1998 NASA mission, as if that was the first time the object was discovered. It's so well done that it makes people question what they remember, even thinking, did I really see that? It went from being a complete mystery to, oh, it's just a spare part. We all knew it was there, but we didn't know what it was or why it was in space. The only reasonable explanation people had at the time was that it could be of alien origin. In 1973, Duncan Lunan wrote an article for Spaceflight magazine, suggesting that people studying long-delayed echoes hadn't considered the possibility that the Black Knight could have come from an alien probe. However, Lunan made it clear that his research had nothing to do with the Black Knight, and wasn't connecting his theory to it. Later, Lunan admitted his method wasn't scientific, and retracted his statement, even saying, "You lied." The problem isn't necessarily with what he said, but the way it was presented made people believe he might have retracted his claims due to pressure or threats. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that NASA still has a lot to answer for. As I mentioned earlier, NASA has a lot to explain, and they certainly provided a lot of details to clear up the confusion. They shared testimonies and evidence that many of these mysteries were just misunderstandings. One of the most intriguing parts of the story happened when the Discoverer satellites were launched in 1960. Dudley Sharp, Secretary of the Air Force at the time, told the press that an unknown object spotted in space was likely the second case from Discoverer 8. He speculated it was probably a twin of another object they had been tracking because it matched the size and location. This was later confirmed, and the identification even made its way into Time magazine, though it was buried on the back page. After all, boring explanations don't capture as much attention as mysterious ones. There's also an interesting side note about the Discoverer program. The CIA was involved in a related program called Corona. In 1992, the details of the program were declassified, revealing that the Discoverer rockets weren't designed to carry people into space. Instead, They were intended to launch Corona spy satellites. These satellites used a polar orbit, which allowed them to fly over the entire surface of the Earth, unlike regular orbits that only cover specific latitudes. Back then, there was no way to send digital pictures back, so film cameras were used. After taking pictures, the film had to be dropped back to Earth to be developed. The Corona KH-1 camera would re-enter the atmosphere, deploy a parachute, and a rescue plane would catch it mid-air. So, even the supposed truth that NASA provided about the Black Knight satellite turned out to be a cover-up for the CIA's spy satellites. While the Discoverer program itself had its hidden agenda, the reported flights and results were accurate. Only the original purpose was misrepresented. As for Gordon Cooper's claims about what he saw during the Mercury 9 mission, it turns out that while he did report seeing UFOs, his story about seeing aliens in space was false. He clarified that the story of him seeing aliens was fabricated by UFO writers. Cooper even showed the official transcripts, including ones he wrote himself, as proof that nothing of the sort happened during his flight. The last piece of the puzzle involves the mysterious object seen in photos from Endeavour's STS-88 mission. According to NASA, the object in the famous 1998 photo was just a thermal blanket that had come loose and drifted away. The STS-88 mission was the first U.S. mission to begin construction of the International Space Station, linking the Russian Zarya module with the American Unity module. Although the crew successfully completed their tasks, there were some issues. The modules didn't line up properly at first, so when the shuttle's robotic arm released them to try again, a few things, including the thermal blanket, got loose. The object in the photo was identified as a crumpled thermal blanket, which had a silver side and a black side. If you weren't familiar with it, the shape it formed might have seemed unusual. Most people wouldn't know what it was, but luckily for the astronauts, it wasn't an alien spacecraft. It was space debris. As for Tesla, it's true that he picked up radio signals from space in 1899. But what he actually detected were pulsars, a type of star that astronomers didn't know about at the time. They weren't identified until 1968. Back then, Tesla thought he was receiving intelligent messages that couldn't be understood, but it was just the signals from a super-dense, rapidly spinning star. As for the Norwegian scientists, they did receive LDE radio reflections, but no one knows what caused them. Today, we have a few ideas about what could be responsible, and most of them involve unusual phenomena happening in the Earth's ionosphere. But if an alien satellite were to enter our orbit, record our transmissions, and send them back to us after an 8-second delay, it could produce the same effect. There are many possible explanations for LDEs, but alien satellites aren't considered a likely cause. Still, it's possible that we haven't figured it out yet because our technology just hasn't advanced enough, kind of like Tesla's experience. Now, regarding the name Black Knight, it turns out it's been used for several real projects. For example, the Black Knight name was attached to Britain's first space rocket, which was tested between 1958 and 1965. These tests were conducted to try out different types of re-entry vehicles, but none of the rockets ever put anything into orbit. The theories surrounding the Black Knight satellite might be influenced by multiple Black Knight projects that were completely unrelated. When you look at all the facts together, it makes you wonder, could it just be a thermal blanket? Maybe there's nothing up there. Or maybe we're overthinking it. But I have one question. How could the object be discovered when neither the Soviets nor the US had the technology to send spacecraft into polar orbit back then? It wasn't until the 1960s that the Black Knight satellite was found again in a polar orbit. Experts say this object weighed over 10 tons, which would have made it the heaviest man-made satellite to orbit Earth at that time. But back then, We didn't have the technology to launch something that heavy into space. As for NASA's explanation of the object being a thermal blanket, this part of the story doesn't hold up in some ways. Both the shuttle and the International Space Station have always flown in semi-equatorial orbits, meaning an object in a polar orbit would have passed by incredibly fast, at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. That's way too fast for the object to have been visible, and certainly too fast for so many high-quality photos to have been taken. I'm not saying NASA lied, but when you piece everything together, it does make you question things. Maybe someone in the comments has a better answer. So, once again, what do you think it was? So leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.